Good morning and thanks for coming, and welcome to Heidi Rose from Wisconsin Anti-Violence Effort. Heidi's been doing this work for 17 years, and one of the reasons why we invited Heidi today was a number of members of the congregation, I think 4 or 5 months ago, Michael Welliver being one of them, had a meeting here at church with our elected officials up in Madison because of concern over the rise in gun violence and how it was affecting our immediate neighborhoods. And I think about the work that Heidi does, and it honors God because it's about the culture of life. And violence and death that's related to guns in our community, in our city, is the culture of death. And that's not what God wants, and it's not what we're called to as a community. Heidi is very good at explaining the inner workings of how we have got to this functional place that we're at with our relationship to guns and our relationship to violence. And my prayer is that through this presentation, we see our own path more clearly about what it is that God calls us to do to create a community of justice and a community of peace, and one that honors life. And I'd like to start with a brief prayer. So, Pastor Carl, would you lead us in a word of prayer, please?
We give you thanks, O gracious God, on this day that we gather to discern your presence and your power and your word. Help us understand the confusion of our world, and where violence becomes such a part of it, and where fear can so many times control our lives. Help us to understand the importance of what it means to control that which destroys. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. Thank you. Thanks, Heidi.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Connor, and the St. Matthew's community. I'm very, very pleased to be able to be here this morning to talk to you about the work that we are doing at WAVE. WAVE, or Wisconsin Anti-Violence Effort, is a statewide nonprofit organization that is solely dedicated to preventing gun violence, injuries, and deaths. So I think I'd like to start out by talking about the scope of gun violence in the United States. Each year in our country, we lose more than 30,000 people. I just want to make sure that excuse me, I want to make sure that's not me doing it. There we go. Sorry about that. So, we lose more than 30,000 Americans to gun violence. The way it breaks down is about 2/3 of the people we lose to gun violence are through suicides, and 1/3 are through homicides, and then there's a much smaller percentage that are unintentional or undetermined. In Wisconsin, each year we lose about 500 men, women, and children to gun violence. And again, it breaks down almost identical to our national numbers: 2/3 suicide, 1/3 homicides, and a small number of unintentional or undetermined deaths. Gun violence is a problem that is unique to the United States. If we look at worldwide, if we look at gun violence, 82% of all firearm deaths occur within the United States. 90% of all women who are killed with guns are killed here in our country, and 91% of all young children killed with guns are killed in the United States. As we talk about this problem, I think we really have to break this down into both personal choices and societal choices. And as we make decisions about our personal lives, it's important for us to be aware of the risks of bringing a firearm into our homes. I think out in the greater world, there's a lot of messages that tell us that in order to be safe, we need to be carrying a gun, we need to be armed, and this is what's going to protect us in the world. And I think it's important as people make those decisions that they're aware of that firearm is much more likely to be used to injure someone within the home than ever to protect the family from a stranger. And when we talk about societal choices, we really need to break that down into kind of the choices that we make in our businesses and then legislation. In late 2011, Wisconsin passed a law that allowed individuals to carry concealed weapons in public places, and we were actually the 48th state in the United States to pass that law. So Wisconsin really, holding true to our Wisconsin values, held strong against that notion for many, many years. But when that law was passed, we saw businesses were forced to make decisions about how they would respond to that. And if they wanted to remain gun-free, they needed to post signs on buildings saying that people weren't allowed to carry guns in those places. And what we saw was our hospitals, our universities, our major big malls all decided that it was safest for everyone to prohibit firearms in those places. And I want to talk a little bit about legislation. So in 2014, Wisconsin Anti-Violence brought together researchers, elected officials, community leaders, and community members to talk about what proactive policies we would like to work for in order to prevent gun violence in Wisconsin and help to make us all safer. So we talked, the main priorities that came out of that series of meetings were that we needed background checks on all gun sales. We needed to prohibit people with a history of violent behavior from being able to purchase or possess firearms. We should institute something called a lethal violence protective order. And then this last point was added after the last legislative session, in which our 48-hour waiting period was actually removed in Wisconsin. So I'm going to talk a little more about each of these things. So what we know about waiting periods, and unfortunately some of this research was published just after Wisconsin removed the 48-hour waiting period, but what we know is that the longer the waiting period, the more of an impact it has in preventing tragedies like suicide, and which is common sense. Anytime that you can put time and space between a person and a tragedy and a response to that tragedy, the outcomes are better. Lethal violence protective orders is something that we've had in a couple states in our country for a long time, and something that we've seen more recent attention given to in a number of other places. Not long ago, there was a campus shooting in California, the Isla Vista campus shooting, which I think probably most people are familiar with. It was something that was in the news quite a bit. And the parents of this young man who was the shooter knew that there was a problem. They were very, very concerned about their son. They had contacted law enforcement. They were concerned that he had firearms. Law enforcement visited this young man, but they didn't have the power to actually go into his home and search for the weapons and remove them. So shortly after, as this law enforcement tried to prevent a tragedy from happening, unfortunately what we saw was this young man go and kill a number of people in California. Shortly after that incident, California passed the what they called was the GVRO, or the Gun Violence Restraining Order. In Wisconsin, we're talking about it a little differently, and it's a lethal violence protective order. And we're seeing it introduced in a number of states around the country. But what it would do is put in place a process very similar to a domestic violence restraining order, where family members or law enforcement could reach out to the judicial branch to bring about an order that would allow them to remove firearms from someone who is in danger of either hurting themselves or someone else. This is a bill that has been, was introduced in the last session in Wisconsin, and we'll see introduced again here this year. We also know that it is important for us to prohibit, the best, I think what we know is that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So someone with a history of past violent behavior has a much higher likelihood of committing future acts of violence. This is something that's common sense. Unfortunately, in Wisconsin, the only people who are prohibited from purchasing and possessing firearms are people who have a felony in their history or some sort of domestic violence charge against them. And this leaves open a very broad area and category of people who are still allowed to purchase and possess guns. So this is something that actually Chief Flynn has been asking for a number of years, and it is something the legislature is talking about right now, although we know that there is quite a bit of pushback against it from the gun lobby and the NRA, unfortunately. And then last but not least, and probably the most effective and policy that we know to help us prevent gun violence would be background checks on all gun sales. In Wisconsin, about 40% of all guns are sold without background checks as kind of private cash transactions. It is a prime example of that was the shooting in Brookfield, where Zena Daniels was killed by her estranged husband. And I'll talk a little more about that in a minute, but to give you an idea, where we see background checks or guns sold without a requirement for background checks and is at gun shows, but I don't think that's where the vast majority of those sales happen. It's just a really easy place to see it happen. Many of them are sold on the internet through a website called Arms List. It's like Craigslist for guns. Unfortunately, there is nothing to prevent this from happening, and this is where the gun was sold that was used to kill Zena Daniel in the Brookfield shooting. Her estranged husband, Radcliffe Howden, bought his gun. He actually posted an ad on Arms List saying, "I have cash, I need a gun." Someone responded to that ad, met him in a McDonald's parking lot. He purchased that gun. The next day, he took a cab to his wife's place of employment and killed her and several of her co-workers in front of his stepdaughter, actually. So if we look at the evidence in support of background checks, in Missouri, they recently repealed a law that would require background checks on all gun sales, and we saw in that state a huge increase in gun deaths. And then in Connecticut, that put that law in place, we see a 40% decrease. So the evidence is out there. We know it makes a difference, and we know it's really important for us to take these steps if we want to prevent gun violence. And the other thing about background checks is that they're very popular. In Wisconsin, background checks are more popular than beer, Aaron Rodgers, and cheese. There are very few things that have that kind of support in our state. So unfortunately, some of the the solutions that are kind of pushed by the gun lobby to help keep us safe from gun violence really are designed to sell guns. And unfortunately, I really think that a lot of that is about the money that can be sold. If we look at handgun sales in Wisconsin, late in 2011, Wisconsin passed a law to allow the concealed carry of firearms in public places. And we definitely saw a huge increase in firearm sales after that law was passed. We know there's been many public statements made by the gun lobby that laws allowing people to carry concealed weapons in public have saved the industry. It is something that they began pushing years ago, state by state, across our country, and we're going to see, I think, in the near future, efforts to pass laws on our national level that would force states to allow people with concealed carry permits from other states to carry in Wisconsin. And this is not a good idea because, well, it's not as big, it won't have as big of an impact in Wisconsin because our concealed carry training requirements are really not very stringent, but there are other states around the country that actually have very, very strong concealed carry laws, and it will impact them greatly. So in Wisconsin, what I would like to call anti-safety legislation that we have seen in most recent years would be legislation last year was introduced that would allow guns to be carried on K through 12 school grounds and potentially in buildings, and that would force universities to allow concealed weapons in classrooms, and also to remove a hunting age requirement, which is usually age 10, which is currently age 10.
Did that legislation pass?
It did not pass. And I will talk about that more as I continue here. We actually worked with a number of organizations across the state to really push back against that, and we were able to stop it. Now, the last item on my list, the removing hunting age in Wisconsin right now, if you are 10 years old, you can hunt with a mentor, so that is a shared gun, which is why we would remove that requirement doesn't seem to really be in the best interest of other hunters and gun owners who are in the woods during the hunting season. But I think there is an effort to bring people into the hunting culture very young. It is, unfortunately, for the industry, a sport that is people are losing interest in over time. So if we look at guns on campuses, again, we understand that crime rates on campuses are much lower than in the general population. They're generally very safe places. And bringing firearms into that situation is not really going to be helpful. But the argument is that we need to remove gun-free zones, and that's where mass shootings take place. If we look at mass shootings that have happened in our country, we really find that a very small percentage of those actually take place in those, quote, gun-free zones. One of the most common crimes that we see on campuses is rape, and 90% of the victims of this crime know or have some relationship to the person committing that crime. Suicide is like a leading cause of death for young people on campuses. What we know is that guns, unfortunately, are one of the most associated with the most completed suicides. and are very fatal. Suicides committed with a gun. There's no second chances in those situations. It's very unusual for there to be second chances. Campuses, the suicide rates on campuses are actually much lower than other public places, and we really think that's because there are fewer guns on campuses than there are, and reduced access to those weapons. I am the parent of a college student. I don't know if anyone else has had experience with college students, but generally I think their decision making, although my youngest daughter I would say is probably the most level-headed of all my children, I think still the decisions that are made by college students, we all know can be concerning, and introducing firearms into a situation where you can often have alcohol abuse and other things like that is just not a good idea. And I think that we owe it to our children to do the best we can to keep them safe.
Excuse me, could you explain that? I don't quite understand that.
This,
Yes. Students who reported having firearms
so
disproportionately reported
disproportionately reported that they engaged in behaviors that put themselves and others at risk. And I think what really the reference is to binge drinking. So students who reported being interested in firearms and having firearms on college campuses disproportionately reported also binge drinking and other behaviors, other high-risk behaviors.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. Concealed carry on school grounds. It has been, so this was introduced in the last legislative session. We were able to prevent that from passing. In the bill, as it was written, would have allowed firearms to be carried onto school grounds, into parking lots, stadiums, and playgrounds. It would have allowed school administrators to decide whether or not to allow concealed carriers in the buildings, but it would have taken away that decision from administrators for the school grounds. And we have heard several accounts from legislators saying that they would like to introduce that again, although I would have to say that we have been organizing in a big way around this issue, and the reports of that have really quieted considerably. We have worked with volunteers to pass resolutions by school districts around the state. Madison, several Milwaukee area, and Appleton school districts have all, and the Association of School Boards have all passed resolutions stating that they do not want to change in the Wisconsin state law that would force them to allow concealed carry permit holders to carry in school buildings and on school grounds. And I think it's important that people make that known. We've also gotten many phone calls and email contacts into legislators stating that this is a bad idea and they don't want to see this again this year, and to this point has not been introduced. So we're hopeful. We do know that this is something we will most likely see at a national level. It is part of the agenda that we've heard reference to by the NRA and the gun lobby, that to remove these gun-free zones, such as school zones. We know that schools, as well as other communities, put a lot of thought into keeping their students safe. There are first responder plans in place in school buildings. It's something administrators spend a lot of time on, and introducing this law really takes that power away from them and actually can put students and teachers at risk. We know that there can be significant costs around this law, change in the law. We've heard law enforcement and first responders talk about how when you're going into a situation, if there is a shooter in a school building, being able to identify who that person is and make and stop that action immediately is really important. And if you have other people participating that law enforcement is not familiar with, it complicates the situation and makes things much more difficult for first responders. In Wisconsin, our concealed carry permit requirements are actually very low. There is no minimum training requirement. And I think that as we think about keeping students safe in school buildings, I can understand how people would say, if we have someone there, maybe it can stop this tragedy from happening. But unfortunately, making those decisions under pressure is something that is very difficult, even for very well-trained law enforcement, and to bring someone in and expect them to solve this problem without the proper training is very unrealistic and concerning. We know that the majority of people in Wisconsin are opposed to this law, and including teachers and administrators. And even if a particular school was able to make decisions about their own school buildings, we know that children and students travel between districts quite regularly, and parents lose control of what is happening to their students in those extracurricular activities. So I've really given you a whole lot of information about both what I think the policies we need to be working for and the policies we need to be working to stop. But somehow, even though these are really quite common sense things, we have gotten to a place in our country where we have been unsuccessful in strengthening even very, very common sense things like background checks on gun sales. And so as we look at why that is, one of the issues that comes up is that people who are advocates for gun rights, this is like their only issue, and they are out there and they're talking to their legislators and they're making their views known and they're making those phone calls and they're showing up in the state capitol. And when we look at people who are working on gun violence, community members who have an interest in gun violence prevention, there's usually a much broader number of issues that they're working on, and so the time can, really solely given to this issue can really be difficult to have that same impact. But what we know is at Wisconsin Anti-Violence Effort and WAVE, we have worked for a number of years to build a growing community and a bigger voice. When I started with Wisconsin Anti-Violence Effort 17 years ago, we had a few thousand supporters and members. We are now at more than 50,000 across the state. We have people who are concerned about this issue, who are supportive of our work in every district and county and community across the state. In the last legislative session, nearly 70,000 calls, emails, and signatures were delivered to the state legislature, letting them know that this is an important issue. So we're working hard to change that dynamic and bring this bigger voice to Wisconsin. We've done this a couple years ago. We collected more than 16,000 petitions supporting background checks and delivered them in Madison. We have annual lobby day where we bring citizens into the Capitol to talk to their legislators. We also will work on issues at the federal level, and this is us delivering petitions to Paul Ryan's office last summer. We have seen our elected officials really standing up for gun violence prevention in a way that I think that we have never seen before at the federal level. But really what it all comes down to is culture change. And in 2013, there was a young woman, Hadia Pendleton, who marched in President Obama's inaugural parade. 1 week later, after she returned to Chicago, she was shot and killed. She was 15 years old. On her birthday, which is June 2nd, her friends decided that they wanted to honor her. And so the way that they decided to honor her was that they were all going to wear orange to try and send a message, because when someone doesn't want to get shot, what they do is they wear orange. And these are young students in Chicago. And actually, one of them is currently goes to college with my daughter, which they just figured out recently. So Wear Orange is now a National Gun Violence Prevention Day. In Wisconsin, in Milwaukee last year, we saw the airport, the county stadium, the Brewers, the Bucks, the art museum, the Pfister, all turned orange in a huge way. And this is really a big deal to see people in our community standing up and saying, yes, gun violence prevention is important. We need to do something as a community to make changes. So we are hoping that June 2nd this spring will be as big and bigger than last year, and hoping to get more communities across the state involved. And so hopefully anyone who is interested in participating and helping out with that will let me know. But so I think this really kind of brings my talk to a close. I'd like to answer questions, any questions that folks have. Go ahead.
Of the suicides that occur, how many of those are minors, and is there anything being done to hold parents accountable who allow guns in their house that are being handled irresponsibly? You know, not locked up, or you know, loaded and not locked up, or...
Right, right. So young people are, you know, I actually would have to look that up to see exactly what percentage. I really actually think a vast, so it breaks down into young people, and there's actually a much bigger portion that are older white men in our suicide counts. But there are people in Wisconsin. We have a law that anyone 14 and under, guns are supposed to be locked up and not made available to anyone under the age of 14. 14 really, and other states really have not been as successful. The penalties generally are minor because it's difficult for prosecutors to go after parents who have just lost a child in a tragic accident. But it is something that we are seeing more and more of as people are becoming aware of the importance of parents taking those actions to keep their children safe, just like you put them kids in car seats and we have them wear seat belts. Making sure that your firearms are locked and stored safely in your home is very important. I would be happy to look that up and let you know the percentage, but I think the two main groups that we see are younger people, but usually I think it's college age, and then this other group of older white men. Yes.
I'd invite your comment in the Milwaukee area, when you look at the murder rate, as we know, by firearms, the number of them that are illegal firearms, not even bought through loopholes. And it would gain resistance to what you're talking about, because people are afraid and they don't want to restrict firearms because they feel they need them to survive. And I'm not talking about the people that own the illegal, but the people that are for less control, so that the so-called person that's not violent but says, gosh, I'm in a violent world, I need this, and I'm gonna resist the sorts of things you're talking about because it might restrict my possibility to survive. I'm
Well,
talking about in the combat zones in Milwaukee.
So
And what
all of the
percentage-
things that I'm talking about are laws that are aimed at keeping firearms out of the hands of dangerous people. There is in no way, we are not trying to restrict access to firearms by law-abiding citizens. So what we're talking about are closing loopholes, and I understand what you're saying, and we are not an organization that's working to prevent anyone from owning a gun. I'm trying to help people understand the risks of bringing a firearm into your own home, and how really, really important it is that we take steps that we need to take to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them.
I should say I'm not speaking in opposition to what you're
Yeah.
Yeah. speaking on. I'm saying
No, I understand.
where the people that are opposing you are coming from.
Yeah, and so, I mean, it is, right now, it is really, really easy to purchase a firearm, either legally or illegally. And we're not pushing back against any of those, legal means of purchasing firearms. What we're saying is that we have these gaping loopholes that we need to be closing up.
But would that solve Milwaukee's gun violence problem?
So some.
It would have a huge impact on Milwaukee's gun violence problem. If we look at Connecticut, that closed that background check loophole, they were able to bring their firearm homicides down by 40%. That's really a big number. That's a lot of people. So, yes, we do believe it would have a real impact on that. So there's a couple people with hands
We're
up.
not able to regulate,
Sorry.
regulate the manufacture and the selling and the buying of guns. What about regulating ammunition? There were some state legislatures, I don't know where they were, but they
Yep.
have been working on regulating ammunition.
Absolutely. I think some of that we see in states that are already doing a really good job of regulating firearm sales. But I think after the mass shootings, we've seen a lot of people who are interested in being sure that people aren't being able to purchase large amounts of ammunition over the internet, and also regulating high capacity magazines, because those are often used in mass shootings, and it's definitely a response that we've seen from people to try and keep people safe. It's something we saw after the Sandy Hook shooting and that horrific tragedy there. So I think that it is something potentially we might want to think about in Wisconsin, but Wisconsin just has no gun laws. There's just all of this low-hanging fruit that we need to take care of before we move to that place. And right here, sir, I'm sorry.
I was wondering, you've been involved deeply for some 19 years. Where do you find your hope? I hear kind of a string of hope to change the culture among young people from you. I'm wondering if there's studies that have been done as more and more women collectively are elected in legislatures. That seems to be somewhat of a place where
Absolutely.
voices are being heard.
Absolutely.
Where do you find your hope?
I think in the gun violence prevention movement, the people I'm standing next to, and fortunately for myself, I do not come to this as the place of being a victim. the people in the movement across this country are victims of gun violence. They have lost children, they have lost their siblings, they have lost spouses. And I think when I feel discouraged, I think that if somebody who just lost their first grader can find what they need to stand up and work for this, I can do it too. I can, you know, so I think that's where I find my hope is because I think the gun violence prevention movement is made up of victims in a way that I think I've never seen in any other movement in this country. And they are people who have lost loved ones.
Who've experienced it.
Exactly. And are finding a voice and coming and working through this out of great tragedy. But
Which is really among the poor in the cities.
and that and parents who lost children in the Sandy
I
Hook
understand,
shooting.
yeah.
And yes, exactly. In the back there.
In the states that have managed to create stronger laws, how were they able to do it as opposed to Wisconsin not?
Right, I think that, you know, the recent states that we have seen making great strides, there's a number of reasons. Connecticut, Colorado, those law changes happened after great tragedies in their states. Both Nevada and Washington State both passed background checks in the last couple of years through ballot initiatives. So when you take it out of control of the legislature and put it into the hands of people, they vote for background checks. They want these changes. And that's why I think this culture change and education is really important.
But we don't have that here.
We don't.
You know? So we're stuck.
I have like ballot initiative envy.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately in Wisconsin we are not, our ballot initiatives are only advisory and we're not able to do that here. But, you know, as this travels from state to state and you see more and more background check laws enacted, it will come here. You know, I think that there comes a tipping point where people are no longer able to say this is a bad idea. Sir?
Yeah, there's a source of weapons that you haven't talked about, and those are ones like my neighbor who just passed away, and I don't know what happened to it. His father brought home a .45 automatic from the Army. He was in World War II.
Right.
Now, he was a medic,
Right.
so he was never checked when he came back, but he brought guns that of other soldiers, unfortunately, that either died or were seriously injured that he cared for in World War II.
Right.
And then you have my father-in-law who was one of the people who liberated Dachau, and after World War II they made him G2, so he could travel anywhere he wanted to in Europe unrestricted. So what he did, he went to Switzerland and he showed me his collection, which he eventually sold to an attorney that took care of his dad's estate. He sent home a 9mm Beretta, which was a very rare Italian handgun,
Right.
Luger, German Luger, English, which he traded for, and Nazi daggers, all kinds of stuff, flags, you name it, he could send it home, along with little things like the whistling man for his mother. But there are a lot of those things that are floating around, and
Yeah.
my father had one, but my daughter never saw it and my wife never saw it because it's hidden away, and it's never going to be used.
Yeah.
But you know, I always think it too. There was a gal I dated back in 1967, and that's a long time ago. She eventually married a police officer in North Carolina, moved there, and out of the corner of her eye saw this guy come running up to her car with a handgun. She had a gun in the car. When he yanked the door open, she fired and killed him because he was a carjacker. Now, if something like that happens, you're going to have you're going to think twice before you rip open somebody's door to hijack their car, never knowing whether they have a gun or not. Now, it wasn't something that she had a permit for or anything else. Her husband was a police officer, and he insisted that she carry that gun for her protection in the car, and she knew how to use it. She was well trained. And that's one of the things too, is being trained. You have a lot of people that have these permits, but they're not really trained on using a weapon of any kind.
Absolutely.
I've never fired a handgun. I've fired an M14, a 60 caliber machine gun, a 3.5 rocket launcher, but
That's a lot.
I was trained by the United States Army to do that.
Exactly.
And should war come along, I was ready to go, you know, but.
Absolutely. I think that, you know, I do think that that is the reason that we have concealed carry laws passed in so many states, is because people really don't want to be victims. They feel like, you know, I could respond. Unfortunately, this scenario that you just talked about is not common.
No,
I mean, it happens. There absolutely are examples, but unusually, usually, I mean, what we see is people freeze. They can't respond in those situations. Their gun is taken from them and used against them. Anytime that you have a crime where you have a firearm introduced, someone is much more likely to be injured or killed by that firearm than actually stop the crime from happening.
Having worked with our police department and getting information when I was on the council, I learned that there are a lot of drugs and things that come into Wisconsin, and the same thing with weapons. These are handguns that nobody knows about. They cross state borders, and they're criminals that have these. They're intended for their own protection as drug dealers or drug traffickers, what have you. We just happen to live in that kind of a world, and you know, and I take my hat off to you for what you're doing. It is important, but at the same time, you know, when my father-in-law told me that the people in the village near Dachau knew what was going on, I asked him, did they have guns? He said, no, nobody in Germany had guns except for the SS, Luftwaffe, and others.
Well, actually, that's one of the first things that, so, I am not as actually familiar with that, but if you Google that whole thing, what happened is that gun restrictions were actually loosened so that people that they wanted to have firearms in Germany could have them. So it doesn't play out exactly the way I've heard that story told by other people, but I'm sorry, I haven't spent a lot of time on that one, so I forget it. It's been a while since I looked it up. Go ahead, ma'am.
Recently in the journal, there were 2 articles about people with concealed carry, okay, who, like one guy shot at a car because his car was being stolen, and then he was charged with injuring the guy who was stealing his car. And there's been 2 instances now, and I'm kind of like, apparently if you have a concealed carry, you can't use it unless your life is in danger.
Right, so it's not legal because you're not judge, jury. I mean, still in this country, when someone commits a crime, we all agree on what the punishments should be, and the death penalty is something that we don't take lightly. So there have been a lot of efforts to loosen the laws around how you can respond when you have a concealed carry license or when you're armed and someone's breaking into your home. But if someone is running away from you, you do not have a right to shoot them. So I think that though there's been, you know, a number of cases where people aren't charged as well, but I think they're really trying to look at them carefully and help people understand. And I think that that is a big part of the concealed carry classes, is understanding when you can and cannot use force.
So they do offer that in Wisconsin when they do instruction?
Well, I know that some of the courses, actually, I heard from somebody who took the concealed carry class, heard all of the information about when you can and cannot use force and said, I want nothing to do with this. This is, it's not really so simple.
Now, there's a practical side of it, and part of the education is to keep you out of a lawsuit should you injure somebody and weren't behaving the way you should be with that
Absolutely,
permit.
absolutely. So here I'm just gonna say that we all have to remember that our voices, and when we bring our voices together, they're very, very important. And I hope that everyone here will join WAVE and lend your voice to helping us prevent gun violence. If you have any questions, this is where I can be reached. On the back table, I have a couple petitions opposing allowing guns in K through 12 schools and on campuses. If that's something that you agree with, I would encourage you to sign that. And I also have a couple different fact sheets talking about guns in schools and our kind of proactive agenda. I just wanted to say that before we run out of time. So
And
please.
we join an organization by going to their website?
Yes, absolutely. You can sign up to receive our action alerts. We'll keep you informed about what's happening at the state level. We really are kind of the watchdog. We have our eyes and ears open. We'll let you know when positive things are happening, which right now there is a bipartisan effort actually in Wisconsin to try and make some changes to help with the gun violence that we're seeing in the city of Milwaukee. So please, yes, go to our website, sign up, join us. And is there any other questions?
One thing I think would be helpful is to talk about those legislators that are taking the side of the gun lobby and are supporting the efforts of the gun lobby. Those legislators and those elected officials should be identified so that when we go, we know who to write the letters to, and also know who we decide to vote for or not vote for. I know that Sheriff David Clark is a big supporter of some of these things you've talked about. He's someone that I certainly don't want to see in office, and I think is dangerous. Who came and spoke to us, Connor?
Dale Kiyunga, our elected
Dale
representative.
Kiyunga is another who is in the back pocket of the NRA. If you feel strongly about this, then that's someone you should really scrutinize his positions. As just for information, it would be helpful to know who those representatives are and what side of the fence they're on, because it's rather black and white. It tends to be a black and white wedge issue. They fall on one side or the other, and if we feel strongly about that, we should know who they are and vote them out of office if we feel strongly about that.
Yeah, I would like to say that I work for an organization that's a 501c3 and we're not allowed to participate in elections. But I really think it is important for us to be aware of where our legislators stand on these issues. There are questions that we need to be asking at town hall meetings, just as it's important for us to understand where they stand on a number of issues.
Yeah, so we're coming towards the end, but so it's quite a draconian thing. It reminds me a bit of work. When somebody has a transgression at work, there's this 1 or 0 response of you should fire them, you should not fire them, but in truth, the world is messier than that. Dale Kiyunga could be more encouraged to support the common sense things that you're advocating for, like universal background checks. And he's our elected official that the church is in and that many of us live in. But he hears on this issue mostly from the people who are hardline gun folks. And he hears from the rest of us on a whole plethora of different issues. But don't underestimate the power of your political voice here in Wauwatosa. It's very powerful. With gerrymandering that we have in Wisconsin, there's not a lot of attention paid to what some of the folks 2 or 3 miles east from here when they make phone calls up in Madison. But our district is one of the few swing districts. And if you contact Dale Kiyunga or Senator Bookmere, it'll make a difference. It makes a difference.
It does make a difference. It really does. I mean, I think that the bipartisan bill that we see right now, Alberta Darling is one of the lead authors on that. She has been hearing from her constituents in a huge way, you need to do something about gun violence. I want my children to be safe in this world. So it's really pushed her over the years, and so I would completely agree. Our voices are so important, and you know, helping your elected officials understand where you stand on this is so important. So thank you.
Sure. So I'd like to thank you, Heidi, for coming and sharing your life's work with us, your vocation, your calling, and we appreciate the work that you do for all of us and for our kids and our grandkids particularly. So,
Thank you.